Your vision is zero. The darkness is so thick you can feel it. The water here isn't clear. It's a viscous slurry of fuel oil, mud, and the chaos of war. You are weighed down by nearly 200 pounds of equipment. You must work entirely by feel, navigating a maze of sharp metal, completely blind. And somewhere, in the dark, invisible killers are waiting. Poison gas, and the risk of explosion. Welcome to the most dangerous job of World War II, the Pearl Harbor salvage operation. December 8, 1941. Pearl Harbor is no longer a naval base. It is a giant steel graveyard. The backbone of the U.S. Pacific Fleet has been broken. To many, these giants were dead. They should be left as monuments to the tragedy. But strategically, this was a disaster of incalculable proportions. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the fleet's new commander, understood a harsh reality of wartime logistics. Building a new fleet would take years. Time was something America did not have. They could not wait. Nimitz gives the order, "Do the impossible. Resurrect the dead ships." If this operation failed, the war in the Pacific could be over before it truly began. The scale of this task was unprecedented in the history of marine engineering. A total of 21 ships needed to be dealt with. Engineers categorized the wrecks into priority groups. The more likely damaged ships, like the Maryland, could be repaired relatively quickly. But the great challenges lay with the giants that were completely submerged, the West Virginia and the California. Sunk, flooded, but thankfully, they remained upright. And then there was the Oklahoma, completely capsized, a literal engineering nightmare. But scale wasn't the only problem. The ships were massive ticking time bombs. Munitions magazines were still filled with explosives. And millions of gallons of fuel oil remained inside, turning the harbor into a fire trap. A single spark could trigger a second catastrophe. To perform this miracle, a unique army was assembled. Engineers, welders, carpenters, and civilian specialists, working around the clock. Commanding this massive operation was Captain Homer N. Wallin, a brilliant naval architect. Wallin understood this mission demanded unheard-of technical innovation, and he needed men willing to walk into hell. The salvage divers, men who had to perform complex mechanical jobs in the most extreme conditions known to man. Initial surveys began almost immediately. Divers made their first descents into the darkness to assess the true damage within. What they discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. The explosions had created a labyrinth of jagged metal. The internal environment was utterly toxic. They realized that standard salvage methods would be completely useless here. They would have to rewrite the entire book on rescue engineering, right on the spot. The first step to resurrecting a ship is to understand its wounds. And that meant going inside. This work was not for the faint of heart. The Mark V diving suit was a primitive life support machine, heavy, cumbersome, and it completely isolated the diver. Inside the ships was a world of nightmares. The explosions had twisted the compartments into mazes of contorted steel. Everything was coated in a thick layer of oil, and they had to work completely blind. But the greatest threat was what they could not see. In a sealed, oxygen-deprived environment, the decomposition of organic matter had created a silent killer. Hydrogen sulfide gas, H2S, extremely toxic and highly explosive. A single mistake in ventilation or a spark from a colliding metal tool could spell instant disaster for the entire salvage team. Every dive was a gamble with death. Consider the USS West Virginia. She was hit by at least 7 torpedoes. Her hull was torn open. To refloat the ship, these wounds had to be sealed. But how do you measure and design a patch for a hole dozens of yards long, deep in the mud, in total darkness? This was the pinnacle of tactile engineering. The divers had to use thin wooden battens to create a template of the rupture, inch by inch. Relaying the information to the surface by telephone, they became the eyes of the engineers. Based on this raw data, the engineers under Captain Wallin's command designed enormous custom patches, which would become known as the Wallin Patch. These were complex structures, fabricated from heavy timber and reinforced steel, weighing many tons. Installing them was a monumental feat. The divers had to guide these massive sections into place, tightening hundreds of bolts by hand, ensuring a perfect watertight seal, under nearly impossible conditions. However, for the West Virginia and California, conventional patches were not enough. The ships were too heavily damaged and sat too deep. Their main decks were completely underwater. The engineering team devised a bold solution, a technique normally used in bridge construction, the cofferdam. They decided to build a massive wooden wall around the entire perimeter of the ship, extending from the hull to above the water's surface. In essence, they were building a dam around a sunken battleship. This was a colossal undertaking. Divers had to clean the hull, then guide massive timbers dozens of feet long into position. Each timber had to be precisely cut to match the curvature of the hull and sealed with rubber, canvas, and even concrete. When completed, the cofferdam was an engineering marvel, a wooden fortress surrounding a steel citadel ready for the next phase, pumping out millions of gallons of water. With the cofferdams in place, the battle to de-water began. Huge pumps ran day and night. Slowly, the water level inside the dam began to drop. But as the water receded, oxygen rushed in, creating an extremely hazardous environment. The risk of explosion from the accumulated H2S gas was at its peak. And as the ship's compartments were gradually exposed, the salvage team confronted the grimmest reality of their work. The environment inside was a catastrophe. Sophisticated machinery, electrical systems, and weapons had been submerged in a corrosive mixture of salt water and oil for months. Everything had to be cleared by hand. More importantly, they had to perform a sacred, yet heartbreaking duty: recovering the remains of their fallen comrades. The psychological toll of this work was immeasurable. Many men worked to the point of complete exhaustion, haunted by what they had witnessed. This was the lowest point of their war. Meanwhile, an entirely different engineering challenge was underway at the wreck of the USS Oklahoma. Completely capsized, she could not be salvaged with a cofferdam. The solution was a technique called parbuckling. This would be the first time it was ever attempted on the scale of a 35,000-ton battleship. Engineers constructed a system of 21 massive electric winches on Ford Island. Miles of steel cable were deployed. The cables were attached to special brackets on the hull. For months, these winches would slowly, inch by inch, pull the ship back to an upright position. It was an operation of extreme tension. The calculations of gravity and stress had to be perfect. Finally, after a monumental effort, the Oklahoma was righted from its watery grave, a spectacular victory of physics and applied engineering. Back on the West Virginia, May 1942. After nearly 6 months of relentless work, the moment of truth had arrived. The pumps were drawing out the last gallons of water. The massive cofferdam structure groaned under the immense hydrostatic pressure. If a single section of the dam failed, or if the whole became unstable, the entire operation could be lost in seconds. All eyes were on the scarred battleship. Would she rise? May 17, 1942. 6 months after the tragedy. A tense silence fell over the USS West Virginia. And then, it happened. With a groan of tortured metal and a rush of cascading water, the 33,000-ton warship began to rise. It wasn't fast. It was a slow, agonizing process as the West Virginia freed herself from the thick mud that had held her for so long. Across the harbor, sirens bled and cheers erupted. This wasn't just an engineering victory. It was an almost spiritual moment. WWII was alive. A tangible symbol of American resilience rising from the very mud of defeat. One by one, the Ghost Fleet returned from the dead. Even the Oklahoma, though too damaged to return to the fight, her successful righting remains one of the greatest maritime engineering achievements of all time. But refloating the ships was only half the battle. They had to be reborn. Towed to the U.S. West Coast, the West Virginia and her sister ships underwent a complete metamorphosis. They were fitted with state-of-the-art radar, powerful anti-aircraft systems, and entirely new superstructures. They returned to the war stronger than they had ever been. The strategic impact was undeniable. In a moment of supreme irony, it was these same ships, led by the West Virginia, that annihilated a Japanese fleet at the Battle of Surigao Strait, completing their revenge for Pearl Harbor. The Pearl Harbor salvage operation remains the largest maritime rescue in history, requiring over 20,000 hours of diving in hellish conditions and 5 million man-hours of labor. Wars are often remembered for their battles and their generals, but at Pearl Harbor, the most crucial battle was fought by anonymous men in heavy diving suits. These engineers, carpenters, and divers never fired a shot. But their ingenuity and courage provided America with the one weapon it needed most: hope. The story of raising the Ghost Fleet is a testament to how human innovation, driven by absolute determination, can walk into hell and bring back a fleet. What do you think is the most incredible feat of military engineering in history? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to discover more extraordinary behind-the-scenes stories from history.